We are a new creation, not bound by the mistakes of the past. Our failures do not dictate our future. There is no mistake that Jesus cannot turn into beauty. He is the brush, and we are the paint. With him, our blemishes are washed clean. Freedom is ours through Jesus. Let him be the sculptor and us the clay, carving away our selfish ways. The creator of the earth molding us into a work of art, a one-of-a-kind masterpiece brought to life. In us is unlimited potential that God can use. You were made with marvelous intricacy. You are beautiful and valued. God has orchestrated a tailor-made plan for your life. May a symphony of love and kindness follow you. Reach out to Christ and grab this life. Walk confidently in the knowledge that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. Because God's plan for your life is filled with hope and a future.
Up this first series at Worship Uncoiled this school year. It's a series that we have simply called Made New, and it's all about how we have been made new and what we do with that newness. And so 2 weeks ago, we talked about how you are valuable and God created you and God made you new, and he is the one that gets to define your value, and it's not based on our own actions or abilities to succeed. And then last week, we talked about how our newness allows us to go and share that newness and live in new relationships with other people. And as always, if you've missed that or you want to hear more about that, you can check out our lessons online on Facebook and YouTube. But this week we are stepping into our final lesson here at Worship Uncoiled, and we are finishing up the series. And I just have one big question for you tonight that is going to kind of be, hopefully, the big question that we have for ourselves all school year. And it's this: who around you needs some newness? Who around you needs some newness in their life? Who needs to feel that value that Jesus gives? Who needs to feel the new life that is found where it's not based on our own abilities, our own actions, or our abilities to succeed? Who around you needs some newness? Tonight we're going to be in the book of Luke. We're going to be in chapter 10. And tonight we're going to look at a story that Jesus tells that kind of facilitates and illustrates this idea of newness and what that looks like, and finding people around us that need some newness in their own lives. But I love the way that Jesus takes people and encourages them to be new. He often does it with stories. Have you ever been around a good, really, really good storyteller? When I was dating Kirsten, we would go over to her grandparents' house for various holidays, and she had a grandpa named Grandpa Bob. And Grandpa Bob was an absolutely incredible storyteller. Grandpa Bob was this guy. He was probably about 5 foot nothing, about this tall, right? He had the use of only his left arm. So only his left arm. And with his left arm, he built his own 2-story house with a basement. He would use a wood-burning stove to heat his house. So he would go and he would just chop down trees and chop up wood to use for his wood-burning stove. For a job, he drove semis across the country. And for a hobby, what he liked to do with his one good arm was take wild horses that were unrideable and tame them. And he would hop on these horses and he would train them and tame them to be rideable with one good arm. It was incredible. And so when we would go over to her grandparents' house for holidays, the rest of the family had heard all of his stories, but I hadn't. And so I would go, and he would be sitting at a table, and I would just pull up a seat and just sit and wait. And whether it was a story of him driving his semi and accidentally ending up with a semi on the streets of downtown Chicago, or whether it was a story of him trying to break a horse that was just absolutely wild, I knew that it was going to be a great story. And Jesus had people around him constantly that were captivated by his stories. And I love the way that Jesus worked in this way, because what Jesus did is he told these stories, and they were so captivating that people would gather around to hear these stories. And then the people would be like, I want to be like that guy in the story. Oh, wait a minute. I guess that means something for my life. And I absolutely love the way that Jesus communicates truth through story. And I think we can learn a lot about that. And so we're going to focus in today on one of Jesus' stories that he tells in Luke chapter 10. In Luke chapter 10, it says this: a legal expert stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, what must I do to gain eternal life? Jesus replied, what is written in the law? How do you interpret it? And he responded, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your being and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, you have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. But the legal expert wanted to prove that he was right. So he said to Jesus, well, Jesus, who is my neighbor? Now let's stop right there, because I want to focus on one important phrase. And it's this phrase right here. But the legal expert wanted to prove that he was right. We've talked a lot this month about how our culture defines value. Our culture defines value by our actions and our ability to succeed. And so often, I think as people in our culture, we want to prove that we are right, because if we are right, that gives us value. We are successful if we are right. We have succeeded if we are right. And so I think this right here applies to us a lot in today's culture. This man was trying to define his value. He was trying to say, look how valuable I am, Jesus. I've done everything that I'm supposed to do to gain eternal life. Now, you tell me who my neighbor is. And you know what this guy was saying? This guy was saying at the end of the day, there are some people in his life that he has the right to treat kindly and fairly, and there are some people in his life that he has the right to not treat kindly and fairly. And he wanted Jesus to say, yeah, man, you're doing it all right. And so often that is where we find ourselves, in this idea of being made new. We find ourselves in this tension of, how do I treat the people around me? Who is my neighbor? And we try to prove ourselves right. Again, there are people in our lives that are super easy to love, and people in our lives that are super easy to live this newness with. But then there are other people in our lives, other people that believe different, and we talked about this last week, other people that act different, other people that are different, people that we pass in the hallways every day, and they're the people that the rest of the culture overlooks. They're the people that the rest of the culture makes fun of. They're the people that the rest of the culture doesn't see, and the people that feel invisible. And as a culture, and speaking obviously in generalities here, so often we try to define ourselves as being right by loving the people that are easy to love. And that's exactly what this guy was trying to do as well. He wanted to prove that he was right. And I love the way that Jesus responds. Jesus responds, which, don't worry, we're not going to read all this, because me standing up here and just reading this would not necessarily be boring, but would be mundane. So, but we're going to go over this. Jesus stands up and he responds with this absolutely incredible story. So we're going to recap this story. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. All right. We're going to recap this story. But before we do that, there's some things that you have to know about the culture in that time. The culture in that time, there were two groups of people that absolutely hated each other, despised each other, wanted to kill each other. And that was the Jews and the Samaritans. The Jews and the Samaritans were always at each other's throat. And the guy that is talking to Jesus, this is really important, he was a Jew. So in this guy's mind that is talking to Jesus, Jews equals good guys, Samaritans equals bad guys. Now, there were a lot of reasons that the Jews and the Samaritans labeled each other as good and bad, but we're not going to go into all those today. For the sake of the story, the guy talking to Jesus thought Jews were good guys and Samaritans were bad guys. And so this story goes something like this. There's this guy, he's traveling down this road from Jerusalem to Jericho. And in this guy's mind that was hearing this story, he would have thought, this guy is a good Jew. He is traveling from Jerusalem. He has been to the place where he's supposed to be. He's a good Jew who is traveling. And along the way, he gets beat up. And along this road, this road actually had a nickname called the Bloody Way because so many people were jumped and beat up and their stuff was stolen from them along this road. And the Jews just knew that it was the Samaritans that were causing all these problems on this road. And so the guy that is listening to Jesus' story would have thought, there you go. There's those Samaritans acting up again. Those Samaritans jumped this guy, beat him up, left him naked, left him for dead, and took everything that he had. And so we've got Jews in the guy's mind listening to Jesus. You've got the traveler. And the Samaritans, you've got the thieves. And in the guy's mind listening to Jesus, again, remember this, in his mind, Jews are good guys, Samaritans are bad guys. And so then this priest walks by. Now, priest, he is a good, solid Jewish guy. He's a good guy. He walks by and does nothing for this man. You would assume he would do something, but he doesn't. A Levite, another solid Jewish, what you would consider a good guy, walks by this guy and does absolutely nothing. And then a Samaritan walks by. Now, the guy listening to this story thought, well, that's it for the guy that was traveling, because the assumption is the Samaritan's going to come by. This is perfect opportunity. Just finish him off and go along your day. But that's not what happens. The Samaritan comes by, who should be, in this guy's mind, the bad guy, and instead, he fixes this guy up. He takes him to an inn, and he pays for this guy to get better for a few days. And Jesus simply asks him one question. You want to be proved right? Who is your neighbor? What do you think? Which one of these three was a neighbor to the man who encountered thieves? Who is your neighbor? And this man who is talking to Jesus is appalled. He can't even begin to mention the name of this Samaritan. He is just like, he's the guy that helped him. Like, he can't even say the word Samaritan. And Jesus tells him, go and do likewise. I was trying to think of a story that would be a similar story for how Jesus calls us to love. And what I came back to is Avengers Endgame. You guys seen Avengers Endgame? Some of you have seen it. So in Avengers Endgame, there's the good and the evil that are just having this huge battle that's going on. You've got Thanos and all of his crazy mercenaries that are out to just destroy the world. And then you've got Iron Man and all of the Avengers that are going against Thanos, and they're fighting each other and trying to save humanity. And at the end of the movie, there's the famous line where Thanos says, "It is inevitable." And Iron Man says, "I am Iron Man," right? And Iron Man snaps and Thanos disappears. And everybody goes crazy and cheers. And I was thinking about how would this fit in here? And I thought Jesus would tell that kind of story, and then Iron Man would go, "I am Iron Man." And he would say, "I'm not going to kill you. Let's all just live in peace." And everybody in that theater would be like, "What? This doesn't work. This does not work." You know, and like, can you imagine if the movie ended like this? Iron Man says, "I am Iron Man," and instead of snapping, he goes up to Thanos and he gives him a hug. And something in Thanos' heart melts, and roll credits, and it's the start of a budding friendship. I think fans would be outraged, because at the end of the movie, Thanos is supposed to die, right? But Jesus says, sometimes our neighbor is the person that the rest of the culture says, forget about that person. Sometimes our neighbor is the person that the rest of the culture says, dude, seriously? Sometimes our neighbor is the person that we least think would ever be our neighbor. Sometimes our neighbor would be like Iron Man and Thanos coming together. And so the question is, who's your neighbor? Who in your life needs some newness in them? Maybe it's the person that you pass in the hallway every day that everybody just ignores. Maybe it's the person that you know is just odd. Maybe it's the person that you know that believes differently, and every time you see each other, you're kind of at each other, and you are feeling an urge to take steps. And again, I want to keep in mind what we talked about last week, being in healthy relationships and not putting yourself in danger and not staying in bad relationships. But so often, we have relegated our neighbor to being the people that are easy to love. And there are people around us every day that need some newness in their life. And sometimes they're the people that aren't the people our culture says, go love them. And Jesus would look at us and he would say, that's the person. That's the person. That's your neighbor. So often, loving our neighbor means loving people the rest of the world condemns. So often, loving our neighbor means loving people the rest of the world overlooks. And so often, loving our neighbor means loving the person that you may have just never noticed before. And so I want to encourage you tonight, who's your neighbor? And the practical challenge this week and this entire school year is I want you to begin thinking of just one person. Just one person that needs a little newness in their life. And I want you to spend the entire school year praying for that person. I want you to spend the entire school year finding ways to practically show God's love to that person. Now listen, I'm not expecting by the end of the school year for that person to become your best friend. I'm not expecting by the end of the school year for that person to make this radical, huge transformation. But here's what I know. I know that if every single person in this room will pick one person this year, And we'll spend the year praying for that person and showing that person practical love and showing that person the love of Jesus. That person may never make a radical transformation in one school year, but they may take a step toward Jesus. And it may be that at the end of our lives, when we get to heaven, Jesus will reveal to us the lives and the generations that were changed because we decided to show some newness to one person this school year. And so I want to encourage you. Who needs a little newness in their life? Maybe it is your best friend. Maybe it's someone you get along with really well and you want them to take a step closer to Jesus. But maybe it's someone you've never considered before. Someone you never thought, well, that person might be my neighbor. And I want to encourage you this year, keep that person in your heart and in your mind and in your prayers and find ways to practically love them this school year. Let me pray for you guys. God, thank you for tonight and the chance to be here. God,